Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Duck Vine podcast. My name is Dustin, and I'll be your sommelier as we go through this episode. Appreciate you tuning in for episode 2 after we finished our Wine Miss part 1 on our first episode. Thank you for tuning in and hanging out with us through this wine journey. I really want to explore wine as a whole and not just what does it take to make wine or how do we get wine today. I really look at wine as a journey through not only locations, because to be frankly honest, I am one that is terrified of flying. My grandfather was a pilot, flew in the world wars. My father was a pilot, career pilot. He retired from that. Terrified to get on an airplane. Absolutely terrified. So drinking wine is a way for me to travel to other countries and experience some of their environments and their culture without actually having to get on a plane. But it can also take us from time as well. It's a great tool just to get to know the world in a different way. Wine as a substance has a huge background that I don't know if a lot of us are aware of. And I think some of it comes down to if you read a wine book, typically you open up and that first section's a little introduction, or they kind of jump into, this is what a grapevine looks like, and this is when we pick it, and then we take it to do this kind of method, and it puts out this kind of juice. And that's great. That's what they're made for. They're wine books. They're not all like history of wine. There's some great history of wine books that are out there on the market that are just phenomenal. Um, Hugh Johnson makes one just called Vintage, which is the history one. Great book. I've read it. It is a historical textbook to the degree. So I don't know if it's the one you'll take home to read in bed every night, but it is very interesting. So wine as a whole, how do we get it? Where did it come from? Where did it start? We know for sure because we have found actual evidence of wine production in Georgia as early as 6000 BC. Now, some of you Bulldog fans out there, I'm not talking about the state of Georgia, we're talking about the country. Sorry about that. You won your football championship, you don't win first winemaker. I'm sorry. Um, Georgia, the country, Iran, Armenia, that area is really kind of like the start of evidence of winemaking. Is that really where wine started from? Probably not. It's hard to tell for sure to have a definitive answer because when you're talking about these dates of thousands upon thousands of years ago, we're really getting into a period of humanity before modern day, bookkeeping. There wasn't a written language. There was some paintings on walls or some carvings, but they just didn't document things like we do these days. I mean, why would they back then? They were fighting for survival. So there's some beliefs or ways that we think we've discovered alcohol or fermentation process because a lot of times today we'll throw out this word like yeast helps the fermentation process, and even in modern day winemaking people will put yeast into their process to start the fermentation process, but yeast is a natural occurring ingredient. So without us ever having to do anything, fermentation process happens regardless. Now, to the extent and what you get out of it, that's where modern winemaking takes it to a whole new level. So, when you talk about the beginning of even alcohol, there's kind of two theories that can go floating around. The first one being as fruit would be on the trees or the vines or whatever it was and ripen up so much that it would fall off as gatherers and hunters that humans are were going around. Sometimes they would find stuff, fruit that had fallen, that fermentation process had already naturally started. So over ripened fruit started the fermentation process. So they are eating these fruits, and then all of a sudden they get a buzz, and then through trial and error, oh, this one didn't, but this one did make me get a buzz. Then they kind of learn what what was not necessarily, they didn't know fermentation was happening, but they were going, oh, this squishier fruit or this drier fruit or whatever uh, gave me these certain feelings. So I think there's something going on there. So then they would start to highlight that. There's also some evidence of when people would be in the vineyards as they started to actually cultivate and grow crops, where the fruit at the bottom of the basket would naturally start to ferment as the fruit on top would squish it and release some of that juice to start the fermentation process, and the yeast started to interact. But again, it's at the bottom of a basket, so they eat everything on top. By the time they get to the bottom, it's had more time to start the fermentation process. It's kind of funny to think about. That's a way that we get, or that we discovered wine, because now that is a modern technique. There is carbonic maceration, where you are literally putting the grapes as a whole into a vessel, and the natural weight from the grapes on the top will start to crush the grapes on the bottom and start that fermentation process. So you can connect the dots there. They have historical evidence for it, and we still use that technique to today, which is really interesting. You'll see some similarities in that as we go through wine and its history. There have been big changes, but at the core of it, there's also like not a whole lot of changes that have really occurred. Um, Talked about where we kind of started: Georgia, Armenia, Iran, those kind of areas. But why? Why did we start drinking wine? Why did we start the production of wine? Again, hard to say. Not worried about writing things down back then, or we did this for that. But we can use some drawings, some artwork that's been found. We have some written history, especially when you get into the Romans, of course, and the Greeks. But it's definitely heavily believed that there's always been a connection, not strictly just for making us feel better, or getting the woes of the day carried away in a different mean, but the religious connection. Whether or not you're talking about Dionysus or Bacchus, in the Greek and the Roman times, or you're talking about ritual wines. Jesus, of course, is famous with his wine. First talks about really, a winemaker. If you really look at the Bible as a whole, Noah coming through his ark, coming off of the ark, they talk about Noah being drunk. So he brought grapes with him. He knew how to make wine. So you can find evidence of wine, especially all throughout history, and how was it connected. Even to this day, I believe in the Jewish practice, they cannot consume wine without it being blessed. Going back to the Last Supper, and Jesus talking about the wine is a part of his blood. It is an identifier for his blood. So it's interesting to see, again, hundreds, thousands of years ago, still having a connection to what we do today. Now, it is still uncertain about the details of the first cultivation of grapevines. Talked. It's been hypothesized that humans were climbing trees, picking berries, collecting them. Talked about all this. That might have changed around 10 to 8,000 BC, because we go from nomadic to more of a sedentary. Wine was definitely grown in the Caucasus regions, Armenia, Georgia, again. So really, really early. Now, when we talk about the first wine, I keep mentioning Georgia. That is the first or earliest archaeological evidence for sure that wine fermentation has been found sitting in vessels. Now, when you talk about how were they bottled, it really change depending on the area. There is some videos that I've seen on YouTube where they were producing the wine and storing it straight underground. So not like in an underground cave, but like literally digging a hole in the dirt surrounding um, the container that they'd put underground would help keep it cool so it wouldn't turn straight to vinegar, which is a very interesting way. It's so neat how we as humans, even before modern day luxuries like refrigerators and cooling systems and freezers, we figured out ways to still keep things cool. Um, Now, there has been evidence of even uh, a grape rice mixture found in China as well. So when you look into the history of it and you start exploring, it was very quickly spread throughout humanity. And, you know, I think a lot of times when we think history, people get into this idea that we didn't travel much and we stayed in these little bubbles of, you know, the Celtics were here, the Asians were here, the Egyptians were here. But the more and more that we are finding, we can see that there is a huge trade even before we thought people were really figuring it out. So it's really neat to know that wine was a part of that. It shocks a lot of people when I'm talking to them about U.S. wine, and a lot of people go, "Oh, California! California is the big. It's where it all started." The first real winery that was set up in what we now call the United States came in, I think, 1609 out of Texas, of all places. Spanish missionaries bringing grapes with them, and as they came up through Mexico and Latin America, of course, they hit Texas first. Wine did play a huge part in California in the 1800s, though, especially during the gold rushes. So wherever humans went, wine followed. Even in Europe, before wine became, or Great Britain, England, before wine became as popular as it is today, that really came around in Bordeaux when uh, a French and a English monarch married. That's when English started importing French wine. So again, another ceremony spreading wine. But when you get into some of these older cultures and how they were developing, wine followed, beer followed. I mean, they called it ale and mead and things like that. But a lot of times, because they did not have quick access to clean water, you know, they did not have modern day plumbing. This was a way of them to take water and purify it in ways. Meads and ales, especially, were boiled. They were produced hot, and it killed off a lot of those germs. And if you think about whether you're trying to develop a new area or it's already a well-developed city and they don't have plumbing, there's not a great way of getting clean drinking water. So those meads and ales that were boiled and heated up help kill the germs. Wine itself is producing its own juice. You don't have to go into the water that maybe if you're in a major city is not very clean because there's no way to get the dirty water out. It was always kind of following civilization around. They also, when producing it, had different kind of strengths to it. They didn't know like, oh, 13% versus 8% alcohol, but they did understand that there was ways to make it stronger or not. And a lot of times they were using these ales and wine as an additional calorie intake for their workers. So they were using it to also keep their communities going, which is a very interesting thing. You look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was growing up, he was drinking non-alcoholic beer because of how much nutrients were in it. There is a lot of natural ingredients in in alcoholic beverages if you find the right ones. Now, they can be doctored up, so don't take that as a medical advice. I am no doctor. Please do not think I'm saying drink beer all the time, you're going to get swole. It's not what I mean. Now, if you go into Armenia, there is the oldest dated winery. So, up into about 4100 BC, we have found evidence of fermentation in wine, but not necessarily like a business or like a designed goal in mind. Until we get to about 4100 in Armenia, they find a winery. They're getting wine presses, fermentation vats, jars, cups. Um, they find vinifera seeds, which is what we think of for modern grapes. So even 4,000 years ago, we were already interested in making sure we had great wine and how we could produce it even better. Um, when you get into kind of the next stages, you're moving into more an ancient Egypt kind of area. It's really interesting when you look at their production. You can see it in their winemaking, their commerce. Uh, it was believed because of its color to resemble blood. It had a superstition around it, which is really kind of neat. They they believed that it was the blood of people who had once battled against the gods, or God's blood, and you kind of see that even into the Greek and the Roman uh, belief system with their background, and that it's a gift from the gods. So two cultures not connected very much, but also have a connection in their beliefs of this was a gift from the gods, or it was a part of the gods. Phoenicians, one of the earliest trade communities that was ever established, have uh, been known to move wine around, specifically using amphoras. There have been amphoras found in the Mediterranean Sea, like thousands of them. The ship has completely deteriorated away, and laying there on the bed of the sea, it's just stacks and stacks and stacks of amphoras. Amphoras, I'm sure we've all seen kind of like a V shape. You look at modern television movies about Rome or Greece, these V shaped clay pot looking things, two handles off the side. I don't really, without having a special holder to build them, I don't know why they built that shape. Because it definitely was not easy to stand up on its own. You had to have something to hold it. But I believe when you get into stacking them, it helped distributed the weight to make them safer to pack, is what I've heard. So there may be a little bit of discrepancy there, but amphoras largely used for a long time. They sat about 36 liters per amphora. So if you could down one of those in a night, you're having a good time. A couple more than just one bottle a evening if you're finishing an amphora. Uh, what's interesting with the Phoenicians is where we can start to see some of our current grape varietals being used back with the Phoenicians, which predate Greeks and Romans. Um, and that's kind of like a hard thing to figure out. When you look at the Romans and the Greeks and read what they say about wine, it was very poetic, very beautiful. But of course, it's a different language. The words have changed, so there's not necessarily like a straight um, connection between, oh, we had Cabernet Sauvignon. Of course, they didn't. Cab Sauv is um, a sun grape of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc, so it's not even as old as those two grapes. But how do we know what the Romans were drinking? There are some grapes that we can connect with DNA evidence that's been found in some of these amphoras. Aglianico, Falangina, Sirtico out of Greece are some grape varietals that you could drink today that we know were consumed by the Greeks and the Romans. So if you want to drink as the Romans drank, find some of these. Aglianico, one of my favorites. You can find it all over southern Italy. It loves volcanic soil, loves Mount Vesuvius. It has an interesting story because about um, the 1800s, when phylloxera is hitting Europe, Aglianico kind of gets forgot about. So we have this ancient Roman Greek grape, but in the beginning of the 1900s, we all of a sudden kind of lose it. And again, a time where keeping written records not even as prevalent as it is now, even though we had a written language. So it gets used as a blending grape until the mid 1950s 60s. Some people start playing with it again, figure out what it was, this ancient Roman grape, and start producing it as a single varietal because it's only been used as a blending grape up till then. And it actually, a producer out of Taurasi in 1968 wins Wine of the World with Aglianico. So it goes from less than 200 acres in the early 1900s worldwide, almost eradicated, to being the best wine in the world. Now it's the third most produced red out of Italy. So you can still find this grape. It's starting to gain more and more momentum. So if you want to try a Roman grape, I highly recommend Aglianico. It is like a bolder Nebbiolo. So keep your eyes out for that. Um, Kind of mentioned in there for a second, a grape called Cab Sauv. We associate that with Bordeaux. And Bordeaux has had a huge history of winemaking, even going back to 500 BC. There is a grave called the Vix grave, and they have this massive vessel to produce wine in. It's over 5 feet tall, so just huge, 450 pounds. It was believed to be able to hold 1,100 liters. They have this still in a museum today, so you can see it. I don't know why I said believe, because they know it holds at least 1,100 liters, which is huge. I mean, I talked about amphora being 36 liters. Now you're talking about a vessel over 5 feet tall that can hold 1,100 liters. But it was used for mixing wine and water. It was a gift that was brought up to Bordeaux, and it ended up being put into a grave. For a noble. So it's really interesting. They found that, I believe, in 1953, and can date it all the way back, not only from that, but the other things found in the grave, to 500 BC. So the French were already starting on wine way back when. So it's definitely interesting to see this collection of history and how it's kind of transformed over time. We'll get into in a future episode some other more modern day history. I think where we're starting to hit is when we get into modern wine day making. So I kind of wanted to start with, like, really the beginning, ancient Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, China making wine. Who even in the modern day today thinks about the Chinese making wine? But they really do, and they've had a long history with it, and they'll continue to do so. I think they say they can date some Chinese grape growing from 7 to 9,000 BC. So that's really interesting. It really has a huge background that I don't know if all of us really connect the dots, because I think we see the movies and we think about the Romans and the Greeks drinking, but really I think when we see wine today, we kind of settle in like the 1800s. It seems like the 1800s and their forward starts a lot of modern day winemaking. And I think part of that is the French paradox, the 1855 classification, Napoleon coming through. These are big factors that influence modern wine making, and we'll jump into them in another episode where we can really dissect those because they play such a huge role. But up until this point, you can really see just how big, how deep winemaking and grape growing has come. Even from where we're stopping now, into talking about that 1800s, and we'll talk a little bit more. But the Cistercian monks in France, and how they figured out where to put great vineyards, and so much has gone into it. It's hard to break it down into one episode. So we're definitely going to do some more episodes on the history of wine. We still have like the Middle Ages to go over, modern era, like how did it spread to the Americas, developments in Europe outside of just France and Italy and Greece. Where did it go into Australia, New Zealand, things like that. So very excited to talk about this part. It connects us not only to wine spreading around the world, but our ancestors and what they thought of it. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in for this episode. I hope you're enjoying the journey. I can't wait for more and more episodes to come out. I'm going to link some of the pictures, like the Great Vase of Vix from that crater, that burial mound. I'll post a picture of that on our social medias. Speaking of social media, make sure you follow us on all of our social media, The Duck Vine, on Twitter and Instagram, so you get all the updates, so you can see what I'm doing in my work weeks from time to time. As well as I want to give a big shout out to Winter Atlas, who created the music and is going to come up with some new intro and outro music. So if it changes a little bit, be excited about that. He's creating something especially for us. Definitely check him out. And then make sure you're tuning in weekly for the podcast. Follow, subscribe. Please rate it 5 stars, thumbs up. Let me know what you guys want to see. I want this to not only be an exciting thing for me to get to do week to week, but an exciting thing for you to tune into week to week. So let me know what you guys want to see and hear and kind of discover in the wine world. I appreciate each and every single one of you for following and downloading and listening. And I hope to see you guys soon.